is Bitcoin really worth $70,000 per Bitcoin according to the market? But it's only worth that in part because the dollars that buy Bitcoin is worth less and less and less. And so we have this widening delta between the value of assets and the value of our currency. There are qualities that Bitcoin has that make it the hardest form of money that humanity has found to this point. It's not just scarce, it is finite and absolute. And there are some risks that go along with that, but there are also some really interesting kind of predicts maybe some future long-term store of value growth in the value of the asset. And Bitcoin is unique in that respect.
For me, I'm always looking for symptoms versus causes. And listeners will know I'm fairly sober about this. So I don't think the dollar is going anywhere as a reserve currency anytime soon. I think a lot of that is overwrought. But that said, I think we are moving towards a world in which the United States was the most powerful country in the world and where the dollar was good enough for everybody to where it's not good enough for everybody anymore. Look at how China and Russia are now trading in yuan and China's buying a bunch of gold. Or look at places, Western Africa, where the euro is actually displacing the dollar as the main form of trade settlement. If we got into places like, for instance, I think Turkey was having a lot of trouble because they were having runaway inflation and they had to crack down on crypto because a lot of Turks were thinking, well, this Bitcoin thing kind of makes sense in an environment where inflation is sort of going 80, 100% and things like that. All of which I think is Bitcoin would have been powerful at any time and the concept would have been powerful at any time, but I don't think it's a coincidence that it came of age as globalization crested and as things started coming back from the brink. And I think the point about that you made about it as a new source of money, there are so many new sources of money and emerging sources of wealth and things that might have been fungible in sort of apolitical ways, like even 20, 30 years ago. I hope we get back there for the sake of the world, but that's not the trajectory the world is going in. The trajectory of the world is actually, there's going to be less fungibility and there's going to be different threats, whether they're political or from stateless actors, hackers, all these other sorts of things that are going to be challenging for people. So we are going to talk a lot about crypto, but I think this is actually one area where crypto is not an exception here. It's actually part of a tapestry of a bigger whole. And so if you're somebody who owns a bunch of real estate and you want to pass that on to generations, actually not that different than cryptocurrency. Or if you're somebody, you sort of alluded to this, if you have a bunch of gold, okay, where is the gold? Who's holding the gold? How are you getting it from point A to point B? All of these are questions that we haven't had to worry about for some time, and maybe we won't have to worry about them, but I don't know, things are getting to the point where I think it's a question to ask.
I think your points are right on. If you also think about the timing of when Bitcoin was created and released into the world, well, what was happening at the end of 2008 and 2009? The great financial crisis was really starting to hit its stride, and there was a lot of soul searching around the financial engineering that led to the economic downturn that the United States and then ultimately the rest of the world felt through that period. And along comes this asset that really cannot be devalued away. It is inherently disinflationary in its nature. We can talk about how the algorithm works in another conversation. If you realize that Bitcoin hit the world in this time of the great financial crisis and kind of kept doing what it kept doing, going through a lot of its own evolutionary process during that time, then we have the great money print that takes place during COVID. We've just dropped this helicopter money all over. American taxpayers or just citizens in the United States just get their free COVID money. The federal government just shows us that the value of the dollar really isn't that great if they're just going to make more of it, print it, and just drop it in your mailbox. And nations like El Salvador, who didn't have their own robust sovereign currency, but that were dollarized nations, realized that the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury can just do whatever they want to with the United States dollar. And if these countries are dollarized, they have no control over what happens to the currency that they now transact in. Love them or hate them or someplace in between, what Bukele did in El Salvador was at least opt out of being a 100% dollarized nation and no longer being subject to the whims of the United States government, how it could impact the people on the ground in El Salvador. We've seen the same thing now with Argentina with Milei. I'm not Bukele and Milei apologist by any stretch of the imagination, but what Bitcoin allows not only other nations to do, but even allows Americans to do, is start to denominate part of their wealth in an asset that cannot be devalued by an issuing sovereign nation. You can't issue more Bitcoin for sovereign debt. You can't just drop helicopter Bitcoin on people. Bitcoin just kind of does what it is. It's like you can't just drop gold on people. I mean, first of all, it would hurt, if not worse. It's a scarce asset. It's an asset that has inherent value just by the nature of how the asset is created. Bitcoin has value. It's represented by the work that goes into producing it. I think it's hard to argue that we don't have runaway inflation, because I think of inflation as spot value of assets increasing relative to the value of the United States dollar. And that may not be a perfect scholarly interpretation of it, but it basically means that every dollar is buying less. And if you go to your local Ford dealership in New Orleans this afternoon and look at a brand new F-250 pickup truck, you're going to see that it's probably $95,000 to $100,000. Is the truck really worth $95,000 to $100,000, or is your dollar just worth less? Is Bitcoin really worth $70,000 per Bitcoin? It is, according to the market, but it's only worth that in part because the dollars that buy Bitcoin is worth less and less and less. And so we have this widening delta between the value of assets and the value of our currency. And so a lot of people are looking to assets like Bitcoin as an opportunity to hedge that delta.
Yeah, and I mean, there's two parts of that too, because if you can do it with Bitcoin, there's no reason you can't do it with your own personal data. There's no reason you can't do it with something like carbon credits. There's no reason that you can't sort of take control of these other things using the same sort of underlying technology.